At the time of recording this, my plan is for this to be my last video on Code Geass, and the first video in a series of videos reflecting on various series overall, usually on missed potential of series. And this video about Code Geass was actually originally just going to be a video talking about Akito the Exiled, because I rewatched it finally for the first time, basically since it finished airing. And it was a very interesting experience because I had basically tuned out basically everything significant about it, or I had forgotten all of it. And if I had watched it before recording either of my previous videos, they would have been a lot different. And then at the end of Akito, something so significant happened that I was going to talk about just that one thing. And then today, I learned something that also changed my perspective a little bit and made me realize I think I just need to talk about the state of the franchise as a whole. And I think that some of the problems of Roze started early. They started a long time ago, and they're not necessarily the fault of the writer of Roze, although that is certainly still a factor. They're just a problem of overall direction for the series, probably under some kind of leadership at Sunrise. And I think that I've identified 4 kind of key issues. Now, there may be more, but these are the issues that I think are affecting the series. The first one is that since R2, basically, as early as then, the series has become increasingly reluctant to getting to the point now that they just outright refuse to explain anything. And I'll expand on all of these as we go, but I just want to lay them out ahead of time. The second thing is that explanations and critical information, if they are ever offered, are relegated to side materials like pamphlets and increasingly obscure manga, games, audio, and picture drama, and all kinds of other material that are not the main anime. The third problem is that I don't think there's any coherent vision here. Now, they claim they have this 10-year plan, so we can't necessarily judge that just yet. But if we take Akito, Resurrection, and Roze as our kind of baseline for this, I don't see the through line. And the final problem that may be the most important here is Sunrise seems to have this obsession with this movie format where they pushed out Akito as, and I cannot believe they did this, a series of 5 1-hour OVA quote unquote movies that they actually released in theaters over the course of 5 years. They released 1 movie per year for 5 years. I can't believe they actually did that. That's crazy. And then they did it almost again, although in a much more reasonable time span, with Roze. And I think that this format is hurting the series. And they need to move away from it and just get back to making traditional series of anime with at least 12 to 24 episodes. So to take this back to the beginning, with the series becoming increasingly reluctant to explain anything outright, I think a part of R1's writing and why it was so strong was a combination of Lelouch as a character and the series itself having both an interest in exploring and explaining the rules of the Geass. And this was something that I think helped establish the comparisons between Death Note and Code Geass, because both series were very, very interested in exploring the rules of their power system so that it could set up interesting and creative scenarios within the bounds of those rules. Lelouch was constantly testing the limits of his power, and we as an audience learned alongside him what it was capable of. And so we have a good understanding of what he could do with it. And this, along with other things, would kind of come back and bite the series in the ass later when Roze, when Sakuya has basically the same Geass and is now using it in different ways. And sometimes when she uses it, it contradicts the ways in which Lelouch's works. But I'll talk about that more later, because at this point, I'm just talking about how R1 explained things really well. And not just Lelouch's Geass, but even Mao's Geass. We had a good understanding of Mao's Geass, and that was important because for Lelouch to beat Mao, he had to understand his Geass. So again, with Lelouch understanding these things, we came to understand it. But I think as early as R2, we started to move away from this. And at the point of R2, it wasn't a big deal. It was there. It was a decline. It was a step back from this kind of pinpoint precision with this explanation. But I don't think that it was a huge deal just yet. But in retrospect, the signs were there. And the first example of this, to be honest, is probably Rollo's Geass, because Rollo very quickly turns from this threat to this tool being used by Lelouch. Rollo is turned into Lelouch's personal time-stopping weapon. But we never really learned the limitations of his Geass, or frankly, even exactly how it works. The only thing we're ever explicitly told is that it stops his heart when he uses it. And so based on that, there's a sort of an inherent limitation of how long he can use it. But that limitation is not ever made. We don't know what that limitation is because we don't know how long he can survive with his heart stopped, right? But everything else about it, we are left to infer and just kind of assume based on the things that happen. So my understanding of his Geass is that he is not stopping time, he is stopping people's perception of time. Lelouch does kind of actually lay that one out, I'll be fair. He does lay that part out. But again, the range and what exactly his Geass can affect, we're not given all the details on this. I think we could be more clear on how his Geass works. And I think if they had explored it more, it could have felt like less of an ass pull when he showed up and used it to bail Lelouch out. Like a lot of people think that Rollo was kind of a plot device. But if they had explored his Geass more, it may not have felt that way. Now, again, Rollo's Geass is not a terrible example of this. It's still pretty good, and R2 is still pretty good about this. Up until we get to the confrontation with Charles in C's world, and we start talking about codes and even how Lelouch deals with C's world and the Sword of Akasha itself. Once we get to this point, I think things become a lot less unclear. And I think at this point, this was intentional on the part of the writers because they had already locked in Zero Requiem as an ending. And they have said they wanted it to be ambiguous. So I think a lot of this was intentional, but it also came back to bite them in the ass later. So there is still some debate about what exactly happened in C's world, because I see a lot of people talk about Lelouch destroying C's world or God, and that's what Resurrection talks about happening. But I never really got that impression. I didn't really understand that as a thing that happened. My understanding was that he communed with God, asked God to basically destroy the Sword of Akasha, which itself was meant to destroy God. And by doing that, he saved God and the collective unconscious and all of humanity. But then in Resurrection, people start talking about how Lelouch destroyed God. And I'm not clear about that. Maybe that's a difference that happened in the recap movie specifically. But that seems like a weird kind of swerve in the plot. Similarly, how exactly Lelouch obtained his code at this time is not made explicitly clear. And I don't think that the recap movies clarify this in any way. But these things are the real beginning of a lot of inference and personal subjectivity needing to be applied to the events happening in the series, as well as what Lelouch knew at the time. Now, based on some other things that I'll get to a little bit later, it seems like strongly implied Lelouch does not know that he inherited a code. Nobody's aware that this happened. Now, I think Akito is where things really jump the shark. Because Akito is where we just stop trying to explain anything. They never truly explain what Shin Hyuga's Geass is. It is purely up to interpretation. It seems to be clear what it is on the surface, but there's a couple problems. One, if you check the wiki, it says, and I'm not saying the wiki is some kind of source of truth, although I would like to think that it maybe should be, but the wiki claims that his Geass only works, it's the ability to cause people that he loves to kill themselves or others. And that's the limitation of his Geass, is it only works on people that he loves, and that's why it did not work on Layla. Now, I don't believe that, because one, if that's true, he got shafted. That's the worst Geass in the world, and it's a miracle he manages to do anything with it at all. Like, the fact that he got a Geass that worked for him, and that he was enough of a psychopath to use this Geass at all, but also not enough of a psychopath that he was still able to develop genuine love that would allow it to work in the first place, that's wild, right? So I don't believe that. But the other reason is that Layla's Geass does activate when he tries to use his on her. So clearly there was some kind of interaction there. It's not just that his didn't work, it's that hers caused a backfire effect. But they, again, don't ever explain this, because Layla doesn't get her Geass until like the last minute, and a lot of people completely misunderstand what her Geass is to begin with. They think her Geass is the ability to rewind time, because when she gets it, time gets rewound. But that was caused by an entirely different character just by coincidence at the same time, who happened to be there, right? Who took an interest in Layla and her crew. But Layla's Geass itself, based on what we see, and again, the wiki supports this, the wiki seems to be accurate in this regard, her ability seems to be the ability to commune with the living. And so what I've taken is an interpretation personally where Shin's Geass is the ability not just to command people to inflict death, but kind of a greater ability to commune with the dead. The inflicting of death is a side thing, but mainly he communes with the dead. He's not seeing visions. He's not crazy. He is actually communing with the dead. And Layla, as his foil in this story, communes with the living. That's how I'm choosing to interpret this. Now, how that protects her from him, I'm not sure. Because it does not seem as if his protects him from hers. Although it's not as if she tried to explicitly use hers on him in the same way. It's very unclear and left greatly up to interpretation. And as well as why and how it did not affect Akito. It is reasonable to draw the conclusion it did not work because he was too young to understand the concept of death. I think that's a super reasonable interpretation. But again, I don't think that that's ever said. And furthermore, it does not explain how it then mutated into this kind of berserker rage. That one, I'm not sure how that worked either. That was not explained. And what's interesting about this is that Akito has a interesting piece of writing in this, in that the technology available in Akito, this brainwave technology, supports and complements the magic, in that the technology they're using to monitor these fighters and to kind of communicate with these fighters syncs with Akito's Geass and allows his Geass to affect his party. And that's a really cool concept. But what bothered me about the show was that they never explore this. Like, the characters never, like, they realize this is happening when it first happens. But there's never a scene of anyone asking, hey, what the fuck just happened? The scientists never sit down with Akito and try to understand what's going on. Nobody ever really questions Akito's occasional kind of psychopathic behavior or things that he says. They don't question or call out at all how he becomes this wild berserker in combat, or how it affects the brainwave technology, or how it affects the rest of his crew. So it's weird that you have this group of scientists and this technology about brainwaves, and nobody ever expresses any interest in exploring those concepts and those ideas. It's all just left vague and up to interpretation. It's very strange. Along with this, the two major elements that Akito introduces that seem to have been dropped and have not come up again, the mysterious skull that appears, who I'm referring to as Geass Satan, because this thing fucking appears out of nowhere moments after a young Shin Hyuga decapitates his father. This floating, glowing red skull appears out of nowhere and offers him a Geass that allows him to kill people and commune with the dead. This is Geass Satan, okay? And they also never truly explain how Shin develops this very unique ideology and mentality that he has that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Although I think even not making as much sense as he does, Shin Hyuga is just a better version of Norland who fits more in line with this world in every way. But it would have been, in my opinion, more interesting if his kind of unique worldview and his psychopathy, his insanity, were a result of the skull. And maybe they are, but he clearly was already pretty fucked up because this like 10-year-old decapitated his father, right? So again, it's left up to interpretation exactly like what this skull is, how it exists, how it can grant him power, and what effect it has. But I think if we had explored that and said, hey, this skull does offer you great power, but at an even greater cost. Again, Geass Satan. It is a devil's. You're literally making a deal with the devil for power, right? People said that kind of about, you know, the Geass in general, but this is to the maximum. And this could have possibly been used to explain a lot of what happens in Roze, to be honest, as written. But also alongside this, they introduced the caretaker of space-time, this mysterious entity who seemingly exists beyond space and time and can rewind and probably even fast forward or travel through time at will, and who takes an interest seemingly in both sides of the conflict, but then ultimately chooses Layla's side, rewinds time to save her and her group from certain death, and then just kind of disappears, and then is never seen again. So we've introduced a fourth dimensional being and Geass Satan, and we don't explain either of their existences. Neither of them are explored at all because they're both very kind of blink and you miss it kind of things. To the point where a lot of people barely even understood that the keeper of space time was responsible for that, and they thought Layla rewound time, right? It's just kind of wild how much is left on the table up to interpretation here. And then this gets even worse in Resurrection in some ways, because now Lelouch is back, and now not only are we not really explaining anything, now we start getting contradictory information, because this is where the idea of killing God starts to come in. So Resurrection never truly explains how or why Lelouch is able to return. At least not the anime. I've heard that the manga does, but I don't have the manga, okay? The manga is not as widely accessible as the anime is. So I don't think that it's reasonable to relegate information to that manga. There's no reason to do that. Put it in the anime. And I actually did rewatch several of the scenes in Resurrection before I made this to see if I missed something. But what's interesting is that the scene where C2 attempts to explain what happened to Colin makes no sense. It's actually just fucking gibberish in English or Japanese. Now, obviously, I don't speak Japanese, but I turned on the subtitles. And maybe there's multiple different subtitles, right? But the subtitles that I read, which line up with the subtitles I've seen in the series before, are very similar to the English spoken language. And neither of them make any sense. They're both very vague. They're kind of gibberish. She basically just says, well, I think he inherited the code, but then he also used his Geass. That wasn't resolved, and the result was the Zero Requiem. That shit makes no sense. That's not a real sentence. Like, I don't know what drug C2 was on for that brief moment in time, right? Like, it's weird how that particular scene seems to be intentionally sabotaged to make sure they can't explain anything. And what's weird is that they do possibly explain this in other materia, or in other material. So the thing that I learned was, supposedly, Lelouch and also Shamna, which is not explained, are supposedly based on the manga adaptation of the original series, the Renya the Darkness manga, and also the Resurrection manga, potentially all mention this, is that Lelouch and Shamna are known as failed ones. They are people who tried to inherit a code, but something went wrong. And so they only got a partial code. They got the code, like the physical Geass symbol on their body. They got eternal youth, but they did not get true immortality. They can be killed. They can hand out a Geass, but they cannot take it back. And also, they retain their own Geass. Now, I think there's a very fine line between retconning and adding like new lore. And I think that this idea really walks that line and threads that needle. But if you had at least explained that in the series, I might be willing. I mean, I actually personally am willing to believe that. But I think other people may be willing to accept that rather than say that the movie just retcons his death. So the idea is that he did inherit it, but something went wrong, probably as a result of all the shenanigans going on in C's world at the time. So it did not manifest right away. It did not actually awaken until his death, and then it awakened in that incomplete, failed state. That was the explanation basically given, but this explanation is not given in the movie itself. It is all left up to interpretation. And what's interesting is that Lelouch himself provides contradictory information. He says in a speech while donning the Zero outfit, he says his famous line, "The only people who should kill are those who are prepared to be killed. Therefore, the world is no longer mine to change." So in that line, he suggests that he still believes he is immortal, or he believes that he is because he no longer can die, therefore he no longer has the right to kill and affect the world. That's my interpretation. But later, when he's talking to Suzaku says, like, "Hey, I'm glad you're back. You should be Zero now." And Lelouch says, "Well, I'm not back. I'm a ghost. I could disappear at any moment." Well, motherfucker, which is it? Are you back or are you not? Are you immortal or are you a ghost? Are you fleeting? Which is it? So Lelouch himself provides contradictory information on this, while C2 just speaks gibberish about it. And again, with this idea that he somehow killed God and that's affected the whole immortality process, when again, I was never under the impression that he killed God. He destroyed the Sword of Akasha by working with God. That was my interpretation of the scene to begin with. So I'm not sure where this contradictory information comes from, alongside relegating potential actual canon lore to manga material that I can't directly reference. So I'm just assuming all this shit is true when it may or may not be true at all. People may just be making it up. I have no idea. Roze is absolutely the worst with this, as I don't need to elaborate on too much, because basically everything about its plot is relegated to side material, right? The entire premise is explained only in pamphlets handed out to Japanese moviegoers. That's insane. And the explanation for the setting, the technology, the villains, everything is explained in these pamphlets. None of it is explained in the movie itself, because I guess they didn't have time or didn't feel bothered to actually write it into the plot. And meanwhile, they don't actually use any of the past information. They ignore all the things that happened in Akito. None of that matters. It's all just this new information repurposing old technology. We are just left to interpret far too much information while given no real explanation in the official anime, the main canon that most people are going to see. And then we are given small fragments of information, but they're scattered across dozens of different pieces of media. You might find some information here in the manga. You might find some information here in the game. You might find some information over here in the audio drama. And everyone gets, and sometimes that information is contradictory, like I pointed out with Lelouch. And so everyone ends up with these different interpretations of the facts and the canon of this series based on this information. And it's just so confusing. It's difficult to have a real conversation about this. Another example of this in Roze is like, I mentioned this earlier. How does Sakuya's Geass work, right? So I saw the theory that her Geass actually requires her to do those theatrics, where she puts her hand to her throat. That's a requirement to activate her Geass. I saw that theory to explain why she does the otherwise unnecessary theatrics. Lelouch never was required to do anything. He just activated it like mentally. He didn't do anything physically. It just happened at will anytime he wanted to. But it's possible that Sakuya's Geass requires a physical action for reasons unclear. And so that's why she does it every time. It's not just a choice. It's how it has to happen. But that is never explained to us, right? Similarly, when we get back to contradicting information, there has always been an implication. This is one thing that was never outright stated in the original series, but it was very heavily implied, and I think Resurrection backs this up. There are several scenes in the series that back this up, that Lelouch's Geass specifically has a stunning effect, where if he makes eye contact with someone and activates his Geass, even before he gives the order, they are stunned. They lose some control of themselves. They're not completely paralyzed, but they're not in full control either. They are rendered vulnerable for the order that is to follow. And this explains how he is able to use his Geass to avoid himself from being killed, right? When someone jumps at him with a sword, this is how his Geass saves him, because they are paralyzed. They are unable to strike him when it is active while he is speaking the words of the command, okay? There's a lot of evidence to back up and support that this is how his Geass works. Now, again, Sakuya technically has a different Geass, but as far as we can tell, it operates very similarly to Lelouch's. It is never explained to us in which ways it is similar or different. And contradictory information, for most of Roze, it is very also strongly implied she has a similar effect, because there are numerous scenes where she walks past a bunch of soldiers on the ground. So if she does not have this stunning effect, am I really supposed to believe that every time she walks into a room full of soldiers armed with guns, they let her pull the wig off, open the choker, do her hand thing, and get the full command out before anybody shoots her? I don't believe it, especially when she's saying like kill yourself or whatever. I don't believe it. There has to be some kind of stunning effect for this to make sense. And this is supported throughout the narrative implicitly, never strongly like stated explicitly, but it is implied, right up until the moment motherfucking Kristoff moves faster than the speed of sound. Sakuya has more or less given the entire order to fucking be under her control, and somehow this guy does it for the first time in the whole series, pulls a gun on himself and shoots himself before the Geass takes effect. I have no idea how he did this. There's no way he should be able to do that. But again, it comes back to why. Okay, so does she also have to say her whole name the whole time? Because she also does that. I, Sakuya Sumamagi, command you, Kristoff, whatever, right? Scissorman. Every time she does the motion and she says that shit, does she have to? Are those the rules? Could she have just said, hey, you're under my control now? Like, why couldn't she do that? Why couldn't it be faster? How is Kristoff able to react so quickly? And for that matter, if he could shoot himself, why not just shoot her? Right? It's bad writing, right? It doesn't make any sense. We're given all kinds of contradictory information about how things work. It's just another example of this, right? You know, similarly, the cloning technology, I mentioned information being relegated to pamphlets and to all kinds of different media. The cloning technology that even explains Norland's existence comes from one of the mobile games. And I don't know which mobile game it is, because not a whole lot of information is widely available about either, because one of them is like completely discontinued by now, I think. And I'm not about to go watch hours of, gotcha game visual novel footage, right? I'm not even sure which visual novel it comes from. I just know that I have heard the scientist responsible for cloning in this universe originates from one of these mobile games. So instead of explaining critical information that we need to know about the world, the characters, and how things work. They are instead going to every random piece of Geass media and pulling out the most random bullshit and dropping it in, also without explanation. It is also not explored or explained at all, the existence of cloning technology. Where is this person now? Are there other clones? Will cloning be more of a focus in the future? We do not know. And you might say, well, obviously, yeah, they brought it in. Why wouldn't it be more of a focus? Well, where the fuck is Geass Satan? Where's the Keeper of Space-Time? We haven't seen them since Akito. Where have they been? So it's not even reasonable to assume that we will see these things again. They introduced cloning. They introduced the Lokis. Are these things going to be around again? I doubt it, especially considering the reception to the last movie was pretty poor. I think they're going to get a lot of criticism for those Lokis. I suspect we're not going to see clones or Lokis in the future because they got a lot of shit for it. So they just seem to keep pulling random stuff, dropping it in alongside 20-second cameos of old characters, and ascending random manga characters from like the Oz canon without actually giving them proper character introductions. Like, if you don't know who these characters are, like I did when I first watched that episode where they were introduced, you would have no idea who these people are. You're just confused. It means nothing to you. They're pointless cameos. And if you do know who these characters are, sure, maybe you get excited for a couple seconds, but is that really fulfilling to you? It's like, oh, Oz was, I don't know their names, right? I don't know who these characters are. These characters are here for 5 seconds. Like, woohoo. Colin shows up for 10 seconds. Woohoo. Somehow 10 out of 10 episode. It's ridiculous. Another reason my video would have been way different, my other video about especially rewriting the plot of Roze, is that Akito introduces these elements, not just Geass Satan and the caretaker of space-time, but also 2 really important pieces of technology, both of which would have been pretty important toward the plot of Roze if Akito was considered. Like, if the writer of Roze had watched Akito or had given a shit about Akito, these technologies would have been critically important to the plot. Like, the idea that Norland was able to hold Neo Britannia for 5 years when Europia was in possession of literal teleportation technology that could have dropped the combined army of the entire world at his doorstep at a moment's notice is ridiculous. It makes no fucking sense. Similarly, his flying fortress and that super mecha that he built probably would not have stood much of a chance against that long-range beam cannon that they built. Also, the Lokis themselves would have gotten obliterated by the various flying technology that has been established in the series. Like, it just doesn't make it. I mean, most Nightmare frames had float units and the ability to fly. I'm sure that most aircraft had bombing technology or cannon technology, something that could have bombarded these things from the sky. Logistically, they're just not even a sound weapon to develop. It doesn't make any sense in the world. For that matter, on the topic of the Lokis, if the caretaker of space-time intervened because they determined that Shin Hyuga was such a threat that he might undermine like the collective unconscious itself, how the fuck did they not get involved when Norland started doing global genocide? That's crazy. And again, where was Geass Satan? I think it would have made perfect sense for him to maybe have a Geass from Geass Satan. And that could have been what driven him to this place at all. Although, with that said, then he would literally just be Shin Hyuga again, but worse. And if the writer of Roze had watched Akito at all, maybe we wouldn't have gotten Norland because they would have realized that someone had already written a better version of Norland to begin with that was not a fucking clone with no actual motivation at all. But all of these things suggest that there's no vision here, right? That they're not actually doing anything based on previous canon. And so if this isn't doing anything based on Akito's canon, why would I assume that the next thing does anything based on this canon? With that said, my question is, what actually new did Roze introduce? Other than the Loki, what new was introduced in Roze? Like, what new technology, what new kind of like overall technology and weapon and nightmare frame? I mean, there were some new types of nightmare, some specific, high level type Lancelot models, basically. But there's always been unique nightmare frames. But how has the general technology of the world improved? Roze introduces nothing new. It just recycles old technology. The Satumbe barrier is just recycling like Geffion technology and Securitite technology. They literally just rebuild a Flea. I don't know. And Norland's mech, it's cool. I really don't actually think it's cool, to be honest. It's big, but its whole weapon is just laser, like Geffion lasers. And that is a unique application of that technology, although I'm not sure how it works, because my understanding is that you needed to constantly apply that, and as soon as you stopped applying it, the Nightmare Frame worked again. But, whatever. That's the only thing they did, is they turned that into a laser weapon, which maybe we'll see that in the future. I'm not sure. That does seem quite powerful, but I'm sure that can be countered, right? And with that, in not just the technology, but how did Roze further the narrative of Code Geass as a whole? Like, Akito did not need to further the narrative of the story because it was an integral. It was there to flesh out the world, although I think it did a bad job of that, and I'll get that to the next section. It did not have to follow up and expand upon the world and the new state of the world. But Roze, as a sequel to the original series that is no longer just a movie about a small cast of characters in an isolated place, it's about the world post-Zero Requiem. It really doesn't explore any of that. It had some ideas, like the idea of Japanese people being racist against Britannians based on, all of the years of oppression. That idea was mentioned, but it was not explored. Similarly, the Black Knights and the UN's immense failure to prevent any of this shit from happening at all probably should undermine people's faith in the Black Knights and the UN and their authority in the world. And maybe that will be an idea moving forward, but we don't get any hint of that in the series itself. It's not mentioned. There's no implication. There's no stinger or hook for such a thing. They don't explore it. They don't have the time. And the reason they don't have the time, like I said, is because Sunrise is obsessed with this ridiculous movie format. Everything needs to be released in theaters as a movie or a series of movies. And it just does not work. It does not allow for the right time, the necessary time, or even the right types of storytelling. I think Akito, if it had been at least 12 episodes, it would have been not just a 6 or 7 out of 10. It could have been an 8 or 9 out of 10. And it could have fleshed out a cast almost as interesting as the original cast if it had time to fully explore Europia as its unique setting. I mean, the Code Geass has always presented it as these 3 big superpowers, and we only ever explored Britannia. Europia and the Chinese Federation were very small parts of the story. And having a story set entirely in Europia was a fascinating idea. Akito had a lot of good ideas and a lot of potential, and it did introduce a lot of interesting ideas that were not fleshed out because they didn't have time. They had 5 hours to do all of this, right? It wasn't enough time. So if they had at least 12 episodes, they might have had a tiny bit more time, right? But I would argue they probably needed 24 episodes, right? A full series, because that would have really given them the necessary time to flesh this out. Now, I don't know if you can justify 50 episodes. I'm not sure about that. But it would have been great to have 24 episodes set in Europia, and then to do another interlude series set in the Chinese Federation that was also 24 episodes, that also introduced or maybe expanded on the ideas that were set up in Akito, also introduced the new cast. Maybe you can explore some of the ideas that were not explored in Akito, like where are the other Knights of the Round, for instance? There are several Knights, like I think the Knight of 8 and 11 still have never been introduced. We have no idea who they are. And up until Roze, we didn't know who the Knight of 5 was anyway. And obviously, we need to throw out who they did decide the Knight of 5 is. We could have explored these ideas, and we could have fleshed out the existing Knights of the Round, who got very little screen time and did very little. We could have fleshed out these characters in these parts of the world in preparation for the sequel series that then could have taken all of these ideas and done another 50-episode series, whatever that would be called, as a true sequel to explore the new world with all of these new elements. But unfortunately, they just seem obsessed with this strange movie format that really cripples their ability to tell stories. And I wouldn't be surprised if the need to have such a kind of apocalyptic, fast escalation at the end of Roze was because they just needed a hook to sell tickets for the last movie. They're like, we got to do something big, so killer robots everywhere. I don't know. I think that may have been a significant motivating factor. So it's not just about the time, but it's about the format. And also, if you have these movies, I think it's less appropriate to spend half of your runtime fucking around chasing cats at a school, right? Coming back to the idea of tone and like how the series understood and used that tone. And this wasn't in my original thesis, but I suppose I'll mention this as well here at the end, is I think something that really has to be said is that the original series understood the value in the humanity of its characters, the value in seeing these characters not just as soldiers, not just as mecha pilots, but as real people, usually just high schoolers. Or if they are adults, they're adults troubled by like realistic problems, right? A lot of people don't understand or they misunderstand the point of the quote unquote high school filler. They didn't understand why we spent an episode chasing a cat around Ashford. We didn't understand why we spent time at like high school festivals building giant pizzas or all of these other weird things that happened. And the point was that we got to spend time having fun with these characters. It doesn't matter how complex your characters are or how compelling their motivations are. If we only see your characters as soldiers fighting in a war, it is more difficult to connect with them as people. The reason that Code Geass has had so much staying power is because of the time that we got to spend with the cast as just normal people outside of the war for Japan and, the Japanese people. And this is something that I think this is part of what made Resurrection work, is that we got to see these characters again and we did spend time with them, not just fighting, but as people. Within the runtime, they made time for the human connection and to follow up on threads that were left from the original series. And this is something that I don't think these movies understand quite as well, or if they do, they simply don't have the time and the necessary format to explore it. Obviously, Akito did explore this a little bit because we did spend some time with these characters outside of combat, but not a significant amount, only a small amount, right? Only in certain areas. Akito at the ball with Layla, and then episode 3 with the gypsies. And that was kind of it. Other than that, they were kind of fighting the whole time. And so when these characters who were mortal enemies suddenly decide to become best friends out of nothing, out of nowhere, it's kind of jarring. And Roze definitely does not understand this because we really don't get to spend any time with these characters as people. We never get to see Haruka dealing with family problems or hanging out with her friends in an environment that has nothing to do with the current conflict. Partially because the setting doesn't really allow for that. They're constantly in the occupied enemy territory, right? So we just don't have time to see these things or to develop these things, but these things are critically important. So if we don't have the necessary format and the necessary time, then we're never going to establish another cast of characters that is as compelling as the original cast. And this is part of Lelouch's appeal as well, is that he was a very dark protagonist. A lot of people, some people, I don't know about it a lot, but some people may even look at him and say that he's a villain. Some people think he is very villainous, and some of his actions are very villainous. But because of all the time that we get to spend with him just being a big brother with Nunnally, or being a friend at high school, being vice president of the student council, and all of these other things that he does, we see Lelouch as a person and we get to understand on a deeper level his motivations and his connections. And those connections are critically important. I mean, part of Colin's whole arc and her deal is her idealization of Zero, the Messiah, and her distaste of Lelouch Lamperouge, the arrogant, do-nothing Britannian who doesn't care about this conflict at all. So when it's revealed that these are the same person, that fucks with her, right? You couldn't do that if we didn't have the time to establish these characters and their separate identities and their separate personalities in different environments. And again, we just don't get to spend the time necessary with these characters. So again, I really think they need to kind of go back to the drawing board with this. They need to look at all of the things that they have introduced to this world. They need to put it all together and figure out, okay, well, we've already introduced these things. We've already opened Pandora's box. We can't close it again. We've introduced the Keeper of Space-Time. We cannot pretend like she does not exist. That's bad writing. You can't introduce the Keeper of Space-Time and then pretend she does not exist when she has already saved a main cast of character from certain death, right? You cannot introduce Geass Satan and then pretend he does not exist, and then also not have any actual legitimate explanation for how people can become so cartoonishly evil like we see in Roze. If you told me Geass Satan was responsible for everything that happened in Roze, and then the caretaker of space-time went and kind of undid a lot of that horrific damage, I would be more on board with the story if you just told me those two things, right? Because at least then it would line up with existing lore. It would explain how people can be so cartoonishly evil, and the damage that they did would be undone, and it would preserve the tone of the series. You could have your cake and eat it too. I'm not saying that would have been perfect, but you've already put these pieces on the board. You've already opened the box and laid out. You've already shown your hand. You have to play with the cards that you have, right? And I hope they can figure out a direction for this, because if they just keep throwing everything out every couple of years and saying, "Oh, we're doing the original plot again, but this time we have a different writer who's going to do things entirely different," I don't think we've got a bright future for the series. So, like I said, hopefully this will be my last video on Code Geass for a while, because I think I have kind of run through everything I needed to say at this point. And I hope I've been able to explain myself, but if there are people who still don't agree with everything that I've said, if they still don't get it, the honest truth is I just think that there's nothing I can say that will ever convince people. If you don't agree with me, if you don't get it, if you don't see things the way I do, we're never going to see eye to eye on this. There's nothing anyone can say to change anyone's mind. It's just how things are. But personally, I hope we start going in a different, better direction for the series that used to be the greatest thing in the fucking world.